this video, I'll be showing you how to make an item pick up and drop system, just like you see here. So firstly, have ready a world scene. Mine is a node 2D with two static bodies in it. A player scene, which is a kinematic body 2D node with a sprite and collision shape. Then of course the item scene. In this case, I'll be using a gun. It's basically just a node 2D and a sprite in it. And now over at the player scene, I have a script which happens to be the only script in the entire project. I have a basic 2D platformer script controller which has some variables for jumping, speeds, velocity, and I have this update movement function which I call back down at the process function. Then dragging the player into the world scene, and also enable the visible collision shape because the map is basically just a bunch of static bodies. Here's what it looks like. So normally, if you want the player to move around with an item, in the case the gun, you just drag it in. So I'll drag in the gun into the player scene and break it down a bit. Then add this function into the player script that checks if the gun exists and flips it in the direction we are facing. Now we have a player that moves around with a gun. Next, let's make it drop it. So create a scene with a rigid body 2D node and a collision shape. I'll rename the scene guns rigid body 2D. Then I'll save it in the same folder as the guns scene. Also adding some key maps, R and E for drop and pick respectively. Now before we move into the code for the player, select the static bodies for the world and open up the collision layers and mask, and also enable the second layer mask. Then in the rigid bodies node, only enable the second layer and mask. The reason why we are doing this is that we do not want the gun's rigid body to collide with the player's kinematic body. Now at the player script, I added two new variables, one for the world and the second for the gun rigid bodies loaded scene. Next, in the physics process function, I check if I'm pressing the drop action key, which is the R button. Then I call it the drop gun function, which is up here. Now what it does is that it first checks if the gun node and worlds are not null, creates a reference to the gun node, then create an instance of the gun's rigid body 2D, set the position to the global position of the gun node, set the reference gun's position back to 0, remove the gun node from the player, add the reference gun to the gun, finally add the gun to the world. If you did all this correctly, the player should be able to drop the gun. Good, now let's head over to picking the gun. In the gun rigid body 2D scene, add an area 2D node with the same collision shape as the gun's rigid bodies node. Attach a script and include this code. First, declare a player variable, then in the physics process function, iterate through the area 2D's overlapping bodies. If it's a kinematic body 2D, then it's our player. Player equals v. v.gun collide with equals self. If player is not null, then if player.gun collide with equals self, and not player in area 2D get overlapping bodies, then player.gun collide with equals null. Back at the player script, create a variable gun collide with, set it to null, then create a function just right under the drop gun, call it pick gun, and what it does is first checks if the gun node exists and if the colliding width is not null. Get a reference to the gun node by getting the third child of the gun collide width, set the position up a bit, then set the flippage property of the sprite. Ask the gun collide width to remove the child reference gun, add the reference gun back to the player, then queue free the gun collide width. Then in the physics process function, we'll check if the action just pressed is pick, then we'll call it the pick gun function. Lastly, here's how we would add items into the world through the editor. First, dragging the gun rigid body 2D into the world. Next, click on the gun rigid body scene and dragging the gun scenes right under it. Now the player can move around dropping and picking guns. If you found this video helpful, leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more stuff like this.